this amazing building. We don't have one of these buildings in New York. I think we need one. We also need a desk. We don't have any desk. So I thank you also for your hospitality, Leandro, and the whole team for organizing this incredible event. I know how difficult and how much work it is to do this, and so I and I'm sure my colleagues are very appreciative of all the work that you've done to bring us here. So thanks also to Cal Whiskey and of course to SAS for doing what you all do, and again for bringing us together. And I want to extend a special thanks to Marina Correa, who helped make the connection in the beginning. And I'm going to try to make some connections, but I'm also going to try to open up some questions. Mostly what I'm going to do is to open up questions that maybe we can discuss. I'd like to be able to discuss the questions of field education that were mentioned earlier, and indeed to think about what we mean when we use the word urban and when we speak of urbanism. Because what I'm going to try to do here. In order to do that, I'm going to try also to bring us back to something like the fundamentals of architecture, if we can say it that way. Some very basic questions. In this case, the question of windows. So keep an eye out for windows. This is all about windows. There'll be some historical examples from before 2008, but it also very much carries over into this more recent period. And a good part of this is going to take the form of a sort of slightly technical report from America that I hope will help us understand what we also mean when we use a word like neoliberal, and specifically when we speak about a neoliberal city or world. So that's the spirit of this. So first I do want to say what an honor it is to be asked to open this extraordinarily urgent and timely project, this seminar, and to do this in this legendary and movingly beautiful building, an incredible building to realize to speak in this building with you here. And in that spirit, I want to extend solidarity to my colleagues here in Sao Paulo and to all of you here in Brazil from Columbia University, and specifically from our own architecture school, Avery Hall, which also had some banners recently. This is the home of our Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, which was designed not by Artigas, but by the Beaux-Arts architects McKim, Mead, and White. It was built over a century ago, and has seen, Avery Hall, this building, has seen the rise and fall of many things. For example, of architectural modernism, but also during the same time, its inhabitants, the students and the faculty here, over about a century, played no small part in shaping New York as a global city. Today, a real estate developer from New York, but now living in Washington, whose career is chronicled, is recorded in that library. There's a library here, Avery Library at the bottom. This figure is in the process in Washington of unleashing capitalism's animal spirits, as we might call them, with a will to power that was born in New York in the fearful, corrupt backwaters, specifically of New York's housing wars, and in intimate deal-making lunches with its corporate patriarchs. I think you know what I'm speaking about. But in any case, I do offer, therefore, solidarity, because my subject this morning, which is the conjunction, the connection of what the ancient Greeks called the demos, or the people, with the polis, or the city, the demos, polis, which will lead us eventually to think about the fragile thing that our cities and our countries still share. That is democracy. I'm going to speak, as I said, mainly about the American case, but before doing that, I just want to offer a tiny glimmer of optimism from the outskirts of New York, from Brooklyn, amidst all of the sadness and the fury. Because when I say solidarity, in this case, I actually mean it very literally, and in specifically urban terms. So here's a little space called Solidarity Space, which is going to open officially 2 days from now on 82nd Street near 3rd Avenue in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is at New York's southern edge, and you're all invited to the opening. Around the corner from this little space is the best Palestinian restaurant in the city. The current US president grew up in a neighborhood very much like this, but mostly white and a bit more affluent. That's not very far from here in Jamaica, Queens. So if you go from JFK Airport, you pass that neighborhood where this individual is from. I have to say that when I look back at that map, I realized in some horror that I was actually born not very far from there, in a very modest town called Valley Stream, while our future tyrant was already stalking the streets of Queens. In any case, Bay Ridge, the home of Solidarity Space, has historically been one of New York's few Republican strongholds, or few conservative areas in New York. This past summer, my son, my teenage son Neelan, volunteered there, traveling an hour and a half on the subway each way and each day, with a political campaign of this guy, Ross Martin, and that's Neelan there with a sign. So Ross Martin is a young crusading journalist in Brooklyn who writes for The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, and a number of other outlets. And he was running for the Democratic Party primary, seeking the party's nomination to oppose the district's longtime Republican state senator in the general election. And this little storefront was their campaign office. And I have to say, since we're in Brazil, and since at the time it was the World Cup season, perhaps in a gesture to the neighborhood's growing Middle Eastern population, prominently visible inside this office, inside the door, was a sort of huge poster, a portrait of the Egyptian footballer Mo Salah. So this is not very common in New York, but this is another form of solidarity. So in any case, as it happened, Barkin, the politician, who was an outsider to the party, he didn't win. He didn't win the nomination. He was one of the young insurgents. But anyway, afterwards, in the aftermath, he and the young idealists, young people working with him, decided to try to keep this little office, this campaign office, open as long as possible as a community center in the neighborhood. So, like this, familiar. The longer-term plan is to form an alternative political organization there. So solidarity in a different sense, something like Bay Ridge Progressives, or perhaps even the Democratic Socialists of Bay Ridge. An idea that, though perhaps a little bit of a stretch, that was unthinkable in the United States in this context until just a few years ago when people reformed the system. So, I completely realize how utterly innocent and in some ways naive this is, this little example. Or, on the contrary, how commonplace, how completely commonplace it is, and yet also how fragile such things are. These small, modest gestures. Hardly radical, it's the kind of thing that maybe some of you, or the kind of thing that first-year architecture students often propose when they're dealing with an urban site. A generic community center in an empty storefront. Adaptive reuse. There are other similar spaces in New York, but as far as I know, none that is quite as explicit about its program. Public solidarity in opposition to the status quo, not just resistance, but opposition to the status quo. Under relative safety, to be sure, since nobody has yet thrown anything through this window. Now, perhaps if they do manage to found a political organization there, the tone will change. In the meantime, the sheer challenge of keeping a tiny storefront like this open, even in an inexpensive neighborhood like this, with no more campaign funds available and depending only on donations from neighbors, this challenge seems daunting, if not impossible, in its own way. Because, of course, solidarity space is rented. It's a small unit of property, taken temporarily out of circulation in the urban real estate market. So this is my way, little way then, of introducing the principal concept about which I want to speak this morning, what I call the urban apparatus. What I mean by that is much more than the urban real estate system, or even the city itself and its other systems. The urban apparatus is, as I would like to define it, a mix of infrastructures at many scales, at all scales, that allow us to know and to think about social, spatial life in cities. That is, the life that joins the demos with the polis, and to intervene in this situation. The urban apparatus makes the urban visible and knowable as such. It's not just an instrument, it's a way of knowing this thing that we call urban. So, for example, with the help of this window, I want to then give some sense of how this apparatus works. This is part of it. Windows like this is part of it. Both as an aesthetic system, as well as one technical system that devoted to maintaining order. The key concept is to make the maintenance of order. It's a very basic architectural sort of process, which is arguably, in that sense, the most architectural task that there is, the maintenance of order. So when I say urban, I'm not simply speaking of a spatial or social category that we use, let's say, objectively, to describe a form of settlement or a way of life, just as if we understand what it means. Nor am I speaking of a division between the city and between city life and country life, or as in urban versus rural. I mean, all of those things are fine, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm speaking instead of a way of knowing the world, of seeing urbanization and its effects everywhere, even in little windows like this, and even in the rural hinterlands or in the rainforests, while also seeing the limits of thinking this way. In defining the urban apparatus as a mix of infrastructures, I'm speaking about more than just a tangle of roads, bridges, railways, electrical lines, pipes, sewers, and satellites that come together to form a city's hardware. I'm instead speaking about hardware at every scale, from the door hinge to the highway, from the door itself to the highway, and about how this hardware orders things, how things like windows and doors order things, how it makes the city visible by differentiating it from something else, the way, in a sense, the ancient city walls used to do, or the way a window helps us to see and know the difference between what is inside and what is outside, and maybe even between order and disorder. And so in doing so, helps us to know architecture, as I said, at its most basic level, order and disorder. And when I use the term apparatus, as in urban apparatus, of which this little window is just a tiny part or a piece, I'm translating into English the French term dispositif, that the philosopher Michel Foucault used to analyze configurations of power and knowledge, like the prison system, famously the prison system, which he called the carceral apparatus, or the asylum, the apparatus of methods. You may also, so we're speaking to some extent about the apparatus of laws. You may also have recognized my description of solidarity space with its handmade signs and its Mo Salah poster as the sketch of a little heterotopia. Heterotopia amidst white patriarchy, amidst the ethnic and racial conflicts that have plagued this part of Brooklyn in recent years. Heterotopia, you may know, was Foucault's term for a space apart, heterotopia, an other space that reflects the enforced norms and exclusions on which the polis is based, kind of like in a distorting mirror. So heterotopia is kind of a mirror that distorts and therefore reveals. In the heterotopia, we see the city upside down, so to speak, and thereby come to know its laws that much more clearly. And again, so I don't want to exaggerate. I'm not making any grand claims. There's nothing exceptional about this little storefront, but there does remain something just a little heterotopic about its relation to its neighbors, including the Palestinian restaurant. So, now I want to leave now this window, this image of this window on the screen for a while, for two reasons. First is that the next part of my talk is going to be more formally theoretical, it's a little more technical. And I don't want to distract you with too many images. And second, because I want to begin this more theoretical discussion, which is eventually going to address the questions that Leandro posed regarding neoliberalism and architecture's so-called post-critical turn, via another example from New York that will illustrate, I think, the concept of the apparatus, the urban apparatus, more concretely. And the example I'm going to offer you, which also has to do with windows as components of the urban apparatus and as ways of knowing the city, is just a little bit more historical. To introduce it, I'm going to first need to add a small caption to the image of solidarity space, of this little window from solidarity space, in the form of an equation. It's called an equation. OJ equals OJ, PJ, FJ, UJ. So this equation shows the formal logic, an economist's equation. You don't need to do that, it doesn't matter. Think about this like a parametric system, a system of parameters. It shows the formal logic behind what became known in New York in the 1990s and eventually around the world as broken windows or zero-tolerance policing. So it's a system for managing the police. A system for measuring crime and punishment that, in the US, has helped to redefine the polis, redefine the city, especially New York, where windows look onto the street as a space of economic calculation. So this is the neoliberal. It's an equation for, in a sense, the neoliberalization of the city. And here's how to read it. So O, the letter O, is the number of criminal offenses that a given individual, F, is likely to commit. Sorry, J. The individual J is likely to commit during a particular period of time. P is the probability of him or her being convicted per offense. F is the punishment per offense. And U is an all-purpose variable that represents a cluster of other variables like income, frequency of arrests, and what the equation's author called an individual's willingness to commit an illegal act. The equation was published by the American economist Gary Becker in an influential article that first appeared in 1968. It was titled, poetically, Crime and Punishment, an Economic Approach. When it's generalized, Becker's equation describes the supply, as he says. This is a supply-side equation of criminal offenses in a given population in a manner that, as he says, quote, follows the economist's usual analysis of choice and assumes that a person commits an offense if the expected utility, the usefulness to him, exceeds the utility he could get by using his time and resources at other activities. So basically, in other words, Becker, who was a Nobel laureate economist, Nobel Prize-winning economist, and who is also Michel Foucault's main American example in his famous lectures on neoliberalism. I can refer you to those if you're interested in the background. Becker translates criminal behavior into a rational economic choice that's describable in mathematical terms. So, with the help of this equation, I want to offer what we can call an object lesson in what we mean when we speak of neoliberalism in the urban context. So this is really a technical definition of neoliberalism, which is a little different, you'll see, from the usual stories of privatization, deregulation, and so on, but it is ultimately related. So in this same very technical little article, Becker elaborates this logic by also incorporating into the overall number of criminal offenses in a given situation, into another equation. It's okay. That describes total societal loss, L. And so basically this is how you make policy, which is L, DO, CDO, you can read it, plus DPFO. Where D is the net cost or damage per offense, P is again the probability of conviction per offense, C is the cost of combating offenses, and B is the coefficient for determining the severity and punishment, F, per offense. So just in case you ever thought you would never do math again in architecture school, here's your chance. Just try to figure it out. The equation established what he calls a policy-oriented criterion L. The idea is to run all the variables and you get policy, which is based on the optimization of all the variables. It's like a parametric equation. You can make them go up and down and see what happens. According to Becker, optimal settings depend in part on the behavioral tendencies of the offenders. Theoretically, what he calls risk prefers, like people who prefer risk, and risk avoiders might respond differently to different values of P, that's the probability of conviction, versus BF, the severity of punishment. In sum, basically what this is a cost-benefit analysis of criminal behavior from the perspective of the potential criminal compared with costs and benefits to the state. So Foucault, who refers to Becker's work, perceives this perspective as typical of neoliberal economics. This is the point. So this is typical of neoliberal economics, which begins, as he says, from the point of view of the person who decides to work, or we can add here, to commit a crime, rather than from the point of view of capital or from economic mechanisms. But, Foucault emphasizes, the shift only takes effect insofar as the human subject, the subject of the polis, is reconstituted as homo economicus, or economic man. So the new subject, according to the neoliberal formula, is economic man, homo economicus. So more recently, the American political theorist Wendy Brown has shown how the neoliberal reconstitution of liberal capitalism's homo economicus has entailed also the displacement of another modern archetype, homo politicus, or a political subject born of the polis. In short, according to Brown, neoliberalism takes economic calculation rather than political sovereignty as its basis. So everything now becomes economic calculation. And especially the democratic sovereignty of a people that governs itself in cities or city-like political forms, including nations. That's what's displaced by this new project. Neoliberal rationality, therefore, these kind of equations, reimagines the demos, the people, as a body now imagined as being comprised of economic beings who, like Becker's criminals, calculate self-interest rather than political beings gathered together, perhaps in solidarity or perhaps also in conflict, in the polis, in spaces like this. Brown sees in this substitution of economic calculation for politics and what she calls an undoing of the demos, an unraveling of democracy. In solidarity with her critique, I want only to emphasize here a parallel, a parallel undoing, or what we can call an unbuilding of the polis, of the city, that also leads to de-democratization. So to do this, again, I want to begin, with windows. Keep going back to windows. So I realize that this is unusual for architectural theory. Even for the kind of architectural theory that I do, this is unusual, or urban theory, to dwell on criminality. But I think that we all intuitively recognize how high crime rates are seen to threaten urban economies, how central crime is to urban imaginaries and to urban policy. Now, rather than associating crime with poverty or other social factors and addressing these through redistributive policies, through more classical welfare state policies or other forms of social redistribution, however, neoliberal urbanism naturalizes social and economic inequality by redefining the criminal as an entrepreneur making cost-benefit calculations just like everyone else. So Gary Becker, the economist I've been discussing, was among the pioneers of an economic criminology that was premised on incentivizing compliance through strict enforcement and strict punishment. In New York City, such measures included what are called broken windows or zero tolerance policing, which was initiated to broad acclaim in the 1990s by none other than then Mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, now lawyer to the White House, and Police Commissioner William Bratton. So this is Rudolph Giuliani's theory of policing, which, according to Becker's student, the urban economist Edward Glaser, this is a kind of popular urban economist, he, quote, calls for strong penalties even for minor infractions, such as jumping subway turnstiles, metro turnstiles, to avoid paying the fare. They would punish people doing that very, very heavily. So you can already hear how infrastructure, in this case the subway or the metro, enters into the equation, literally into the equation. Now, the underlying theory of law enforcement that's associated with this approach was first advanced by George Kelly and James Q. Wilson. It doesn't matter, you don't need to know who they are, but it was in a widely read article that's titled Broken Windows. The police and neighborhood safety, broken windows. So architecture, they're right in the middle of it, broken windows, which appeared in 1982. Kelly is a criminologist and who worked for New York City's Metropolitan Transit Authority, which is the subway, the metro, and consulted with the New York Police Department on the theory's implementation. Wilson, his co-author, was a political scientist who did his graduate work at the University of Chicago, where Becker was taught. This is all Chicago School of Economic Theory. The key passage from this article, the Broken Windows article, from which the policy took its name, linked crime with visible urban disorder. And I'm just going to read it to you here at length. Okay, so this is from this article. It says, quote, social psychologists and police officers tend to agree that if a window in a building is broken and is left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken. This is as true in nice neighborhoods as it is in rundown ones. Window breaking does not necessarily occur on a large scale because some areas are inhabited or by determined window breakers, whereas others are populated by window lovers. Now, rather, one unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares. And so breaking more windows costs nothing. And then they add, it has always been fun. Somehow window breaking is fun. Now, what's most striking about this passage and about this general argument is that it moves the source of criminality into the physical environment, into the windows, in a manner that blends essentially social constructivism with rational choice economics. In other words, it locates crime in the city's physical and institutional infrastructures, where boundary conditions must be maintained. Continued breaking of windows suggests that the parameter P, remember that's the likelihood of conviction in the equations, is not high enough. Kelly and Wilson, the article's authors, argue that breaking more windows costs nothing when environmental indications, or what they call signals, are that petty offenders, these window breakers, will go unpunished. In other words, that no one cares. Which creates a general impression of lawlessness that encourages escalating cycles of criminality. That's the theory. You know this, you're familiar, this is a familiar theory. They don't explain, however, why breaking windows, or crime in general, is fun, and therefore inevitable. Only that it can be prevented by strict enforcement tactics, strict policing, which in practice has significantly raised incarceration rates across the United States, especially among African American men, such that order visibly reigns over disorder. The policy was implemented in New York through a crackdown on minor offenses like jumping subway turnstiles to avoid paying a fare, and most famously by targeting the city's squeegee men, they're called. These are the guys who washed car windshields. You have them here too in Sao Paulo, right? Who wash car windshields at traffic lights in hopes of being paid for their services. So they crack down on those guys and they punish them. So the broken windows policy was therefore literally infrastructural, in the sense that it's typical sites for subway turnstiles and street intersections. But more importantly, it was infrastructural in the sense that as boundary conditions, windows, like turnstiles and other such sites, mark thresholds. They're borders, boundaries, at two levels. First, they distinguish inside from outside, and second, they distinguish two possible states for the polis: unbroken and broken. That in turn corresponded to two subject categories, two states of being for the demos: orderly and disorderly. So you have a broken or unbroken polis and orderly or disorderly people. And that's the point. So as a threshold between environmental order and environmental disorder, then a window takes the form of what they call a signal. It's also a filter that separates orderly from disorderly beings. Window breakers, according to the authors of this theory, are not necessarily violent people, nor necessarily criminals, this is the quote, but disreputable or obstreperous or unpredictable people, panhandlers, drunks, addicts, rowdy teenagers, prostitutes, loiterers, the mentally disturbed. These are their categories. These are like Foucault's categories. Now, more generally, a window is a filter that separates what they call regulars, in other words, people who belong there and who follow the rules, and as they say, who know their place. Separates regulars from strangers, who are viewed with suspicion. So it's a border question. Regulars do not break windows. Strangers might. So you can see now how easily this window-based classification translates into other distinctions at other scales, some at the macro scale. In the black, white versus black, native versus immigrant, and so on. And us versus them logic that is built into the equations. So these equations have all this built in. Urbanists will also recognize these categories in the forms of surveillance to which they correspond as what are sometimes called the eyes on the street, promoted by urbanists like Jane Jacobs or the defensible space of Oscar Newman. To be sure, such racially coded distinctions and such ways of ordering the world, backed up as they are by an armed police force, invite us to see them as extensions of the prison system. But equally, they invite a reading that takes the distinction between order and disorder as literally as Kelly and Wilson's would-be criminals supposedly take a broken window, and, like strangers out to have some fun by smashing things up, addresses that distinction on the aesthetic plane. And so this is what I want to conclude really with, is a kind of reflection on what we call the aesthetics. Now, because what is aesthetics here but a struggle between Apollonian order and Dionysian intoxication, between sanitized dreams of order enforced by the police or by architects, and by what Friedrich Nietzsche called, in his aesthetic philosophy, quote, the tumultuous wild chase across all the scales of the soul under the influence of narcotic stimulants or when the drives of spring are unleashed. That's Nietzsche. Nietzsche's words remind us that the sobriety of social science, the sort of seriousness of those equations, is underpinned by a will to power that rests to a considerable extent on aesthetic foundations. That is to say, the foundations of social science remain embedded in the interplay of imagistic dreams and libidinal, desiring intoxication. Breaking windows is fun, but for whom? For disreputable or unpredictable people? Or is it really only fun in the minds of those who wish, above all, to control their own sublime fear of such people? The fear of strangers, through the arts of governing, which in this case entails nothing less than the reordering of the world as economic calculation. So what, in other words, explains the mixture of pleasure and pain, the measurable mixture of what Kelly and Wilson call fun and what Becker calls cost, around which this particular relation between polis and demos is organized. What is sort of, how do we explain this? Now to try in the remaining 15-20 minutes here to answer this question, I want to consider briefly the urbanism of Gary Becker's student, who I mentioned earlier, the economist Edward Blazer. As he explained and elucidated in a popular book from 2011 that's called The Triumph of the City. How our greatest invention makes us richer, smarter, greener, healthier, and happier. So it's a kind of neoliberal message. The overall message of this book, The Triumph of the City, is that the benefits of urbanization outweigh its costs. As with crime, so with everything else. Cities are brimming, according to Blazer, with entrepreneurs, including would-be criminals. Adjust the equations to incentivize compliance, minimize cost, but invest wisely in disincentives when necessary. Moreover, in Glazer's eyes, cities are a good investment for another related reason. For they're populated by human capital. This is another key term, human capital, or what Foucault calls abilities machines. In a near parody, Glazer speaks of what he calls, quote, the concentrated talent of the big city, and celebrates the resourceful, bootstrapping entrepreneurialism of those living in Rio de Janeiro's favelas, who, as rural to urban migrants, Brazil works its way in, rural to urban migrants or their descendants are following what he calls a path to prosperity that nevertheless brings fortune to some, quote, and suffering to others. Committed as he is, and generally as urbanists of this sort are, to an actuarial, profit-oriented language of pros and cons, which he calls the urban paradox, for its inability to explain the coexistence of wealth and poverty. Glaser repeatedly concludes that, from a societal point of view, cities, rather than villages or suburbs, this is where we should be skeptical of the urbanization discourse, right? I think this can be used in this way. Cities, rather than villages or suburbs, represent the investment most likely to pay off, quote, by making us richer, smarter, greener, healthier, and happier, as his subtitle would have it. So in this subtitle, and his discourse more generally, we find evidence of change from the kind of neoliberalism that Foucault sketched so vividly in 1978-79 in a series of famous lectures titled The Birth of Biopolitics. There, in those lectures, Foucault speaks of what he calls an abilities machines, when discussing Becker's work on criminality and on human capital, as exemplifying the emergence of the new Homo economicus. Homo economicus, economic man, is an abilities machine, especially in linking investment to education. Foucault asks, what constitutes this investment that forms an abilities machine? Like, how do you make an abilities machine? You educate them. The answer is that it can mean hours, it can, for example, mean hours spent by a mother with her child, or, quote, the simple time parents spend feeding their children or giving them affection as an investment which can form human capital. Foucault, like Becker, sees this investment as primarily instrumental or utilitarian in character, where abilities are constituted functionally and operationalized. Parental affection leads to enhanced economic performance. And Foucault is, of course, reading this critically, but family life, education, healthcare, and mobility all extend economic rationality, that is, the production of human capital, into realms previously taken as extra-economic, if not existential, in nature. Hence, for neoliberal thought, migration, for example, this is Foucault now, quote, migration is an investment. The migrant is an investor. He's an entrepreneur of himself, who incurs, or herself, who incurs expenses by investing to obtain some kind of improvement. End quote. This extension of entrepreneurial thinking to the level of populations correlates with Glaser's The Triumph of the City, this hymn to rural to urban migration as the so-called path to prosperity. But Foucault's underlying productivism, we can even call it functionalism, doesn't fully explain the qualitative rather than purely quantitative rewards promised by urbanization, according to Glaser, for whom an urban population is, yes, a richer one, but also a smarter, greener, healthier, and indeed happier. As well. So that's what he says. In an interview from 2015, Glaser, whose father Ludwig was an architecture curator, Ludwig Glaser was an architecture curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the MoMA curator, his father. He was interviewed about this, and he deflected the question that somebody asked regarding neighborhood preservation with a kind of general disclaimer. He says, one of the beauties of being an economist, he says, rather than an architect, is that I have no standing on aesthetic issues. And of course, this is absolutely untrue. On the contrary, standing on the side of order, he, with a host of other economists, urbanists, and criminologists in the background, continues to build a political, economic, and aesthetic discourse, a discourse of order and disorder, with associated policies devoted to taming the drunken delinquents and addicts of the post-global city. In its most recent form, which Glaser's work exemplifies, this discourse converts the calculating, Apollonian, rationally choosing Homo economicus into an intoxicated Dionysian god. Furthermore, despite disclaimers, this new Dionysus is racially marked, which is what connects the aesthetics of neoliberalism, that is, fixing broken windows, with police violence that, in the United States, targets young black men and the disproportionate incarceration rates that come with it. Now, in 1979 in France, writing in France, Foucault said, this is where we have to put theory in perspective. Foucault said of traditional racism, and he was speaking mostly of anti-Semitism, that when compared to the calculations of investment in human capital, while it was still something to be feared, this was 1979, it, quote, does not seem to me to be the major political issue at the moment. Well, of course, Foucault was wrong. And he probably also underestimated the important role played by race in defining the concept of human capital in the first place, although he's actually very eloquent about this. I really encourage you to read his lectures. For example, Becker concludes, we're back to Becker the economist now, he concludes one of his early works, a different work called The Economics and Discrimination, a market-based study of racial discrimination, the economics of discrimination, a market-based study of racial discrimination in the United States that he first published in 1957, that is during the Civil Rights Movement. With a brief summary, he says this is his summary of his theory about racial discrimination. Employers and employees have what he calls a variable taste for discrimination that lead them to incur various psychic costs. A discrimination coefficient can, he argues, be formulated from these variables. These coefficients are, in turn, influenced by what he calls more fundamental variables, which may be inferred by relating discrimination coefficients to an economic analysis. So we're back to the equations. Correlating such variables with others, such as relative concentrations of black and white populations in certain job markets, relative levels of education, residential segregation, and so on, Becker produces a quote, case study in the quantitative analysis of non-pecuniary, in other words, that is social or emotional, non-fiscal or non-economic variables. So, before really fully concluding, I want to make this just a little bit more concrete, okay? To bring it, in a sense, to live reality. And to do this, I want to offer an example of how the theory plays out. So, this is Amadou Diallo, seen here wearing a USA t-shirt. Amadou Diallo was a 23-year-old Ghanaian immigrant described by the New York Times as a street peddler who was actually a mobile entrepreneur, and as such, a unit of human capital, preparing to study computer programming in New York. He had migrated from Guinea in sub-Saharan Africa to New York. On February 9th, 1999, he was struck by 19 of 41 police bullets while standing in his doorway, his own doorway in the Bronx, reaching for his wallet. Now, Diallo was, of course, from the post-colony. It's therefore possible, maybe even likely, that his reaching for his wallet, was a gesture of deference to the state. The fatal misrecognition of one form of racially profiled policing, that is, the one that checks your papers, so reaching for his papers, for another, which fixes windows. So in 1909, the German sociologist Georg Simmel wrote of the window, the great theorist of the metropolis, wrote of the window that, unlike the door, its, quote, emotion is directed almost exclusively from inside to outside, and is there for looking out, not from looking in. Walter Benjamin would later reverse this, looking into windows along history's one-way street. Broken windows policing neutralizes this directionality. As a signal, a window, whether broken or unbroken, is there to be looked at, and to be decoded, rather than to be looked through in either way. A broken window means nothing. It simply reflects a disorderly environment. The same holds for a threshold or boundary condition, like the border between nations or the doorway in which Amadou Diallo was murdered. That is perceived to be violated by strangers who belong neither inside nor out with its own door. It ceases to function as a passage and becomes a screen. Broken windows discourse directs police attention to anyone who lingers too long on that screen, as though they're on an endless bridge or in a revolving door. The white, plainclothes police officers who emerged from a car on a darkened street and killed Diallo were members of the Street Crimes Unit, or SCU. The SCU had been enhanced financed by the Giuliani administration under Police Commissioner William Bratton, the city's chief proponent of broken windows or zero-tolerance policing, and further expanded and oriented around what's called stop and frisk policing by Bratton's successor, William Sackler. These are all the things that are being contested to this day in the States by Black Lives Matter. In the ensuing trial, the officer who had first noticed him testified that Diallo, who was standing in the vestibule of his own building, fit the description of a known serial rapist and was behaving suspiciously, like a would-be robber. The officer acknowledged that he and his colleagues did not consider that Diallo might have lived there, nor did they consider the situation from Diallo's point of view. We can infer then that Diallo appeared to these police who, like him, were subjects of the broken windows apparatus. Everybody is the subject of this apparatus. And of the urban apparatus more generally. They perceived him as a stranger marked by his race, his gender, and his location in the city, and his position at the threshold between inside and outside the doorway, like a window about to break. So, is it perverse then to analyze this tragic scene from an aesthetic point of view? No, not if an aesthetic of urban order partly accounts for its outcome. This aesthetic can be summarized by the risk and reward variables that were laid out in equations by economists like Gary Becker, but it cannot be summarized in those variables, but it lurks within them nonetheless. Not simply because these equations set the stage for a neoliberal police and the associated reordering of the urban realm that recast its subjects, citizens, and would-be criminals alike as homo economicus, but also because it recast homo economicus and with him the abilities machines of human capital as potentially disreputable or unpredictable. Intoxicated by repeated encounters with such disorderly figures, aesthetics steps out of the night, gun in hand, and fires. But what do Diallo's murder and the larger tragedy to which it belongs have to do with architecture or urban theory? So here we're going to finally get architecture or urban theory to conclude. At the other end of the apparatus, the broken windows are prisons run by private corporations that are scattered across the rural American countryside. All of this, including Becker's equation, belongs to the larger urban apparatus with which I began. As a mechanism for preventing windows from breaking, this discourse also belongs to the centuries-long lineage of Polizeiwissenschaft, or police science, from which the field of urbanism itself was born. But what may be less obvious is that, like neoliberalism itself, Becker's equation can also be construed as a formula for breaking windows, rather than protecting. So in this sense, the equation reveals something like the true spirit of neoliberalism, which can be decoded through close architectural analysis. All of the events I've described, from the publication of Becker's equation to the murder that it predicted, took place during the period from 1968 to 2000, when Western architectural discourse was negotiating its way out of modernist utopianism, around postmodern language games, and toward what would eventually become known as post-critical cynicism. I'm not going to waste your time with these twists and turns, all of which, we can discuss them if you want, all of which amount to nothing more than a tempest, a little storm, and a tiny disciplinary teacup. I mention them only to remind you that the theories of architecture circulating in that teacup, many of which have sought to preserve the discipline's alleged autonomy in the face of mounting social conflict, were and remain essentially metaphors. Whether they speak of linguistic structures, immutable types, or formal codes, built or not, broken or unbroken, drawn with pencil or written with ones and zeros, the problem with most theories of architecture is not that they focus too closely on architectural issues at the expense of social or political ones. The problem is, on the contrary, that most architectural theory is not architectural enough. Or to put it differently, the problem with most architectural theory is not that it's too abstract. Rather, unlike Becker's equations, most architectural theory is not abstract enough, which makes it unable to account for things that actually matter, like the life and death situation in which Amadou Diallo so tragically found himself that night in the Bronx. After all, in order for these equations to make sense, a real window, not a metaphorical one, somewhere at some point had to break, literally, not metaphorically. Well, the law normally considers the destruction of architecture, including its constituent elements, like windows, as a crime. How to address that crime is the subject of Becker's equations, which, as I've tried to explain, helps to write the neoliberal economic laws that stand silently behind the police. These economic laws, especially those that position all political subjects as abilities machines or entrepreneurs, reshape the relation of the demos to the polis. Before these laws stand Homo economicus, economic men, a being whose life is lived as a calculus of financial risks and rewards formalized in logical mathematical expressions. But you've noticed, however, that in defining neoliberal urbanism through the example of broken windows policing, I've avoided more traditional and equally valid definitions that emphasize privatization, states versus markets, or the conversion of public goods into private profit. Nor is this a story of deregulation per se. If anything, the state's regulatory mechanisms, the police, have been enhanced when it comes to managing populations. I've stressed instead that aspect of neoliberalism that unbuilds the demos by separating it from the polis, which, as Wendy Brown has shown, ultimately poses grave dangers to democratic citizenship. I do so in response to the commonplace dismay in the international public sphere at the we're all trying to figure out, the transformation of neoliberal globalization with its promise of unregulated economic freedom, so-called, into the transformation into fearful, aggressive nativism or nationalism. I tried to show how this sorting of the demos into a sovereign us and a foreign them is written into the neoliberal DNA, with strangers breaking windows in the equations that I've described. So just to conclude on this point, then, I want to turn very, very briefly to the windows of solidarity space in Data Ridge, Brooklyn. And I want to ask you to imagine this window broken. Now, the shattering of its glass could, of course, be accidental, or it could be the effect of a hurricane that's not yet connected to climate change. It could also be the result of a robbery or a simple, spontaneous act of vandalism, of kids having fun, already factored into the equation. But it could also be a deliberate act of symbolic political violence, like the swastikas and anti-Semitic graffiti that have appeared elsewhere in Brooklyn this year. If so, could the breaking of this window still be described as an economic population? Yes, but only when the polis, to which the window belongs, and the demos that it gathers under the sign of solidarity, have already been torn apart, unbuilt, undone, broken, and de-democratized by the calculus, the economic calculus that I've just described. For the polis here is not only a space of appearance in Hannah Arendt's memorable phrase. Its windows, doors, and screens are the infrastructure of the demos, the means by which a people are constituted as such, or deconstituted. When the polis and its elements are reduced to variables in an economic calculation, and individual costs and benefits replace solidarity and cooperation, the body politic fractures. Paradoxical as it may seem, this kind of unbuilding is the work of a machine for producing and maintaining order. The economic order of capital, with other orders and other powers waiting in the wings. In 1938, don't forget, Hannah Arendt's Germany had its Kristallnacht, its night of broken glass, when some 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to the camps. I'm not saying that the unbuilding that we're talking about here is equivalent to that. No. I'm only saying that windows are broken for different reasons, under different historical conditions. But no matter what or when, the order in question is always aesthetic, as well as political and economic in nature. So should solidarity space survive the pressures of urban real estate, anyone who breaks its windows would be subject to police discipline. But think of other contexts, like state-sanctioned political violence, where the variable O, the sum of crimes and punishments, would tend toward zero. Step out of the equation and you see the invisible hand of power behind the neoliberal traffic in human capital. Such violence is not foreign to neoliberalism. Signs can simply be reversed and variables redefined to permit or even encourage this kind of violence. In the name of order, to encourage the breaking of windows and of the fragile solidarities that they signal. Readers of political theory will recognize this circumstance that I've just described as the notorious state of exception, in which the voice of the demos is silenced and the sovereign stands above the law rather than before it. I do not wish to contemplate this possibility further. I hope only to have shown how, thinking literally with architecture rather than merely theorizing it, we might understand how solidarities might still be built to counteract the neoliberal unbuilding of the polis in order to rebuild the demos on which democracy depends.
Reinhold, thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. It was a very great way to start your event and seminar. Eu vou falar em português para ficar mais fácil com a plateia. Antes de passar as questões ao público, eu gostaria de colocar algumas perguntas ou questionamentos em relação não só ao que foi apresentado aqui, mas talvez um pouco em relação à sua trajetória como acadêmico e professor, que talvez nos interessem, porque muitos de nós conhecemos o seu trabalho, mas eu acredito que alguns estudantes mais novos não conhecem a obra como um todo. Então, em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta relacionada a certos temas que você desenvolve, desde Utopias Ghosts, e tentando ou procurando fazer relações entre o urbanismo, a arquitetura, a biopolítica, e usando, obviamente, um instrumental via Foucault e, mais recentemente, Agamben, que nos pareceu e nos parece, dentro do nosso contexto acadêmico local, algo bastante distinto do que foi criado e desenvolvido nos Estados Unidos, principalmente nos anos 90, onde a crítica se via muito mais amparada ou, digamos, relacionada com aspectos formalistas e, de uma certa maneira, de uma certa aceitação do neoliberalismo como um sistema único, inexorável, imutável, sem nenhuma possibilidade de acirramento ou contraste via urbanismo ou a arquitetura. Falo de Sylvia Levin, ou Jeff Kipling, por exemplo, tá? Só para criar um dado. E eu queria entender a sua posição hoje, né, num momento talvez ainda mais crítico do que 2010, com Utopias Ghosts, o seu, mais talvez relacionado ao seu livro recente, de 2016, onde as questões que já eram levantadas, né, por alguns críticos nos anos 90, se acentuam após o 9 de setembro, né? Desculpa, 9 de setembro, e se acentuam depois da crise de 2008, e agora, mais uma vez, se acentuam num ambiente, né, político marcado por alguns nomes emblemáticos como Trump e aqui Bolsonaro. Essa é a minha questão.
Now, yeah. Okay, well, okay. Yes, thank you. I just have lots of big questions. So we'll start with the architecture theory side. Yeah, you know, that was one reason I wanted to speak today about something that happened in the 1990s while all of that theory was going on, the post-critical, because what was really happening was the neoliberal transformation of cities like New York, or, you know, all the American cities. But I don't consider myself an anti-formalist. I'm not again. In fact, I would say that in some ways, and I hope I was able to demonstrate that just a tiny bit, what I aspire to maybe more is something like a radical formalism. You know, I showed you equations. You know, in this case, it's necessary, for example, to use the tools of aesthetic analysis to understand this discourse of order and disorder. I mean, you know, order and disorder is something that we in a room like this are all familiar with. We understand, we think we understand at least what we mean by words like that. And I'm trying to use that understanding, but at the same time translate it back into a different system of ordering things and to compare. And one reason for doing that, besides the you know, critique implicitly of postmodern or whatever we call it, some various forms of architectural formalism, autonomy. Basically, those are they're variations on the taste cultures in which the purpose of criticism is to train students into certain kind of tastes, speak certain languages, formal languages, excuse me, not necessarily to reproduce those, but to reaffirm them by critiquing them. So it's a kind of narcissism. That's why I called it a storm in a teacup. It's basically, you know, like looking in the mirror and talking to yourself. And that's a situation in which you look at a mirror and you see someone, you see yourself. Another way, I said this in Utopia's Ghost, there's a chapter on mirrors, which I try to explain something similar to what I was saying about windows here, is to try to learn, and again, you can do this with the training of architects, how to look at a mirror. Look at the mirror, not in it. Look at the window, not through it. And see what you see. Like, you're not going to see yourself. You're not going to see architecture mirrored in some sort of a critical discourse. You're going to see a piece of the world. Mirrors are real things. They're not metaphors. So it's like that. But then that sort of, maybe you could say, turns on its head. Another way that I have tried to say this is that when in doing architectural analysis, the further inside you go, the more architectural you get, the more formalist you get, in a sense, the further outside you get. I've tried to show this with respect to specific architects and their discourse that's in the earlier book that you mentioned, that the discourse on architectural autonomy is actually a way of conforming architectural theory to basically a kind of environmental behaviorism that the protagonists of that theory thought that they were opposing. So I'm also using the tools of dialectical analysis. I remain committed to thinkers and the tradition of thinkers like Manfredo Tafuri, but using these very differently than someone like Tafuri uses. Yeah, do we want to say, about biopolitics? And the latter part of your questions. This is one way of saying this, that I really wasn't talking so much about the ideologies of neoliberalism, what their beliefs are of these. It's the techniques. These are the techniques. These are the techniques of the police and of the urban planners, and again, we have access to that as students of spatial techniques. And so I'm just trying to show a way of looking at a window to understand something about the larger world, including the political world. Of course, I took an explicitly political window to do that kind of analysis. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Eu já estou recebendo questões, se alguém quiser enviar. Eu quero dar um espaço, se ainda não chegaram. Eu posso fazer uma outra, vou aproveitar e fazer uma outra pergunta. A ideia da janela quebrada e dos espaços que você nos mostrou hoje se assemelha muito, ao meu entender, numa hipótese de conceber tanto a arquitetura quanto o urbanismo a partir de uma reflexão relacionada à vida cotidiana, nos termos do Henri Lefebvre, como não só como uma abstração, que muitas vezes ela é colocada dessa maneira até com uma suposição estratégica, mas algo que faz parte do nosso dia a dia, da vida ordinária cotidiana. E essa relação do cotidiano com a cidade, a arquitetura e o urbanismo, tal qual pode-se ver no SESC, ou no SESC que visitamos, ou na postura do SESC de modo geral, para nós ela é de fato transformadora, né? São por esses elementos que talvez a nossa disciplina poderia atuar de uma maneira mais enfática em relação a uma certa resistência ao que alguns tentaram denominar ou transformar a cidade numa espécie de empresa com valor de troca, também usando ainda dois termos lefebrianos, né? O valor de troca e valor de uso, via max, lefebriano via max, mas que para nós hoje é um termo muito importante, porque nós tivemos aqui em São Paulo, tentando trazer essa discussão para a nossa realidade, duas administrações absolutamente opostas. A primeira, que justamente anterior a essa, tentou reconectar a cidade com as suas sensibilidades urbanas, né? Entender o urbano, a arquitetura, através do prático sensível dessas relações cotidianas, criando uma série de políticas públicas que procurou aproximar a população em relação a essa cidade complicada e complexa que nós temos. E a administração seguinte fez justamente o contrário, assumiu o papel de que, por exemplo, ele não seria um prefeito, seria um CEO, e São Paulo não seria uma cidade, seria uma empresa. E tentou organizar a cidade a partir de uma série de privatizações, ou seja, evitando qualquer tipo de manifestação ou crescimento dos espaços públicos, da esfera onde realmente existiriam as trocas urbanas mais afetivas, mais não ligadas às relações comerciais mais diretas, né? E isso para nós foi um choque, tanto que esse prefeito abandonou a prefeitura, está agora no governo do Estado. E eu acredito que nós, pelo menos aqui, os professores da USP, grande parte dos alunos também, de uma maneira bastante homogênea, né? Não acreditamos nessa possibilidade de se pensar a cidade meramente como uma empresa, né? Ou trabalhada apenas no seu valor de troca. Então, eu queria justamente tentar entender, né, de sua parte, como você analisa ou vê esses processos de acordo com, enfim, com as referências teóricas que você desenvolve e acompanha.
Yeah, another complicated question. Yeah, well, thanks. I'll try to be both theoretical and also speak empirically about some cases. But first, on the FEV and the production of space and everyday life that you mentioned in the beginning, I'll invite, if you to read the introduction to the book Urban Apparatus, where there's on the one hand, there are some reflections on the FEV. They're critical to some extent, because I think one of the limitations of thinking the city from the point of view of everyday life in the FEV is that, first of all, use value is naturalized, is separated out from other aesthetic processes. Use value is pre-aesthetic, and in the FEV, except that when what is the FEV doing? His dream, his fantasy, in a sense, is the medieval town. It's a pre-modern, pre-Renaissance town. And so in that sense, I think Lefebvre undoes his own critique by fetishizing another kind of, first of all, there's nothing democratic about the medieval town, but besides that, fetishizing certain forms of life, which I do, of course we appreciate street life and everyday life. And so I'm glad that you recognize that, attempt something like a critique of everyday life from the point of view of a street window, that at the same time recognizes the necessity always of thinking over and over again critically about the aesthetic categories and the fetishizing that goes on, even amongst radical or in this case, Marxist political thought. So that's a kind of subtlety that we can speak further about if you like. In terms of urban policy and so on, we're just, again, I'm reporting from the US, but it's happening all over the world. The entire nation is being governed as a corporation, and it happens to have a certain kind of CEO at the top who's behaving, badly. But the structure underneath that is quite has been building for decades. Right? It's been building since at least the 70s, and so cities like New York have been, in a sense, the first cities to undergo these kinds of transformations. And we could talk about housing, for example. I know others will talk about that later today. So, I mean, there are many factors and sectors of urban life that are affected by this. You could call it an aestheticization of the city or commercialization of the city, but I want to insist that there's nothing that escapes this problem of order and disorder. We have to figure out how to think about it, not just to refuse it.
Reinhold?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Concordo totalmente. De fato, o Lefebvre voltou a ser uma leitura importante para nós, justamente pela relação direta que ele tem se demonstrado com os nossos problemas cotidianos aqui em São Paulo e no Brasil, mas também pela maneira como ele foi reinterpretado por alguns autores, como David Harvey, Rebel Cities, Cidades Rebeldes, mais recentemente, entre tantos outros. Mas, de fato, nós temos um pouco a mesma percepção. Os instrumentos lefebvrianos são realmente muito pensados numa situação específica, né, de cidade medieval, pré-modernização, que tem, obviamente, grande utilidade como, em algumas situações, como ferramenta, mas, de fato, não são totalmente completas para a situação do mundo hoje, né, principalmente na realidade de cidades complexas como São Paulo. Então, é justamente por isso que nós estamos organizando esse seminário, e essa pesquisa tenta justamente dar um salto a mais do ponto de vista da teoria e dos métodos em relação às questões lefebvrianas. Vou trazer algumas perguntas aqui do público. Qual seria o oposto das práticas neoliberais no ambiente urbano? O que se opõe à política de janelas quebradas? A pergunta do Pedro Pires. Pedro?
I know, I always get those kinds of questions. What's the answer? In a sense, it's for you to work on, but I'm not going to try to give a formula for that. But I certainly think that we can begin with categories like solidarity. That's why I began with this very modest little space, which can operate at many different scales and connects with ultimately policy debates and ideological ones and so on. From my point of view, I'll give you the example through housing, okay? Because I wanted to talk about that. Do I have a few minutes? Yeah. So housing was the first, maybe at least right on the cutting edge of privatization in the U.S. and again, really all around the world. And I know it happens here too. So, housing in the U.S. was never, the U.S. was never a socialist country, but was closer to the public housing I'm talking about, social housing, to the European welfare states, New Deal, the New Deal housing projects. Those sit in many cities, like New York, but also in Chicago. They used to sit, they don't exist anymore, or Detroit, many other cities, on very central land, on land that's right in the middle of the city. So this is like the David Harvey version of this analysis we can do. In other words, that we begin with the ground. We begin not with capital volume 1, if you want to, we get really technical with Marx. We begin with capital volume 3, with the question of land. And we go back to that problem and realize that all kinds of reasons were given in the beginning in the 80s, and this was assisted by the Congress for the New Urbanism. In other words, a certain branch of postmodernism to rewrite the policy in the 1990s in the United States that argued that for the good of the people who live there, who were living in substandard segregated housing, that housing needed to be demolished. Okay, fine. But what did they do? They privatized. So the argument was then, they would rebuild it with the same number of units and so on. This almost never happens. The various studies have looked into this. Because this is unvaluable land, the real argument was that the market could house people in more efficient ways than the state or some other collective agency, right? So a simple answer to this at the level of the housing question, which I have tried to develop in various other ways, I've written about it, spoken about it, is to return to the housing question. Ask the housing question again. I know you do here, but ask it from the point of view of the values of solidarity, of redistribution, of sharing the wealth. Not of exchange value of the land underneath the house, and it's very difficult to do. I've tried that with students in various ways to get your head around that, because in a sense the entire economic imagination has to change. Now, what that would be called, what it would look like, of course we can debate that. And again, I don't want to foreclose that debate. I think that in a sense what should happen is we should debate those kinds of questions, but debate them very concretely. And architecture is very useful for this, because we can look at housing or some other building type or something and say, okay, how to think this, how to think it critically. Go back and read Engels' Wohnungsfrage, the housing question, and begin there. How to respond to that critique. And you may have to reinvent the whole society, but at least you will be beginning with something very tangible and concrete. Yeah?
Outra pergunta do Rafael. Rafael do nosso grupo. Difícil entender a letra, mas você considera que a sua leitura sobre o neoliberalismo é histórica, trata do passado, ou prospectiva, trata do futuro? Ainda podemos falar de redução neoliberal do sujeito a um agente econômico em um momento em que... Redução neoliberal do sujeito a um agente econômico em um momento em que a violência se torna central central como a xenofobia, racismo, etc.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. In the past, well, I want to understand this as an ongoing process. This is somewhat historical in some of its details, but this is repeating over and over again, various ways, different places. In the U.S., this would be discussed probably most commonly or most generally in relation to, as I mentioned, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very much now. Trying to reduce incarceration rates, to get rid of some of these laws. That a lot of this has to do with drug laws and things like that, to keep people, out of prison. So that, basically, the most to the housing question, the largest housing program in the United States is the prison system, and it's very present now. But there are changes. So another way of saying something like what I was just saying is that this new economic subject who's making rational choices is themselves, he or her, changing. Him or herself, they're changing. So for example, you could say today that in some areas, not all, not on the street, but to some extent in other spaces like offices or even studios, that the new economic subject is an artist, is a creative person, is, you know, an entrepreneur in a creative sense. Sometimes I describe this to students to make it really feel tangible, is somebody with a CV. That's who this person is. It's somebody who has a CV and sends that CV around, or maybe uses a website to do that. And often that CV might have the word design on it. And they could come from many different fields. They could come from business, they could come from computer science, or they could come from architecture or industrial design or the visual arts, you name it, but design. So design is a newer version of this category. And I think this is one reason. I mean, there's a discussion going on as we speak right now about Amazon relocating its headquarters or building new headquarters. They've been blackmailing U.S. cities for tax breaks to bring, you know, their so-called their system to New York, to cities, and New York is one of them, and specifically Queens. That's where MoMA PS1 is, and it's where a lot of artists live. It's like one of the arts districts, where real estate is less expensive, but also it's associated with the arts. So I think this is something that Foucault didn't really see. I mean, it wasn't really happening when he was discussing this. So this is something that's new, and it pertains directly to us in our fields here. The role played by creativity as a sense exchange value as well. So.
Não quero tomar muito tempo de vocês. A partir das 2 horas daremos continuidade ao seminário. Gostaria de agradecer mais uma vez ao público, professores e alunos que compareceram e nos prestigiaram. Agradecer mais uma vez ao Reinhold pela palestra e disposição em nos acompanhar nesse seminário, a todos os nossos convidados, como eu já disse, de diversas universidades, e especialmente a Mariana, Catherine, Marina, Cássia, Rafael, Fred, que nos ajudaram de uma maneira excepcional durante todo esse processo. Obrigado.